Okay, so this is a process concept of relationship by Eugene Gendlin, and from the year 1957, so same year as the introduction to experiencing that I read the other day. So I want to read this one. So one of the basic things in Gendlin's philosophy, as I understand it so far, is that everything is an interaction. In a process model, he talks about this more than elsewhere, but that we are not contents, we are interaction, we are a process. I've said that in other videos, but a process model is an alternative philosophical model of reality, which is built not from everything being atomic units that then get put together and combined to make things, but rather that everything is in process to begin with, that there is not any divisions between things at the most basic level, and that the divisions, individuation between things occurs after the fact, occurs analytically, coming from us, with our thinking. And so he talks a little bit in a process model, just kind of as an example one time, talking about this interaction way of seeing relationships. So relationships, for example, between a therapist and a client, that it's not two separate entities that come and just bump into each other, but that there is an interaction, where interactions in ourselves to begin with, everything in us is moving and interacting with everything in us. We are an interaction with our environment, constantly in relationship to it, breathing in the air, our lungs take in the air, our body changes meanwhile, and then we exhale, and the waste of that goes back into the environment, and we are just in every way an interaction with what's around us. And a relationship with another person is another version of that. We are an interaction, and then we encounter someone else, and then they are part of our environment, Everything about them now is part of our environment. The way that they look, the way that they sound, the way they smell, the vibes that we get from them, What we know about them, what we've heard about them from other people, we are in interaction with all of that, and them vice versa with us, So Gendlin talks about this in process model, that when we come into relationship with someone else, it is novel. There's a novel thing happening, a completely new thing, It's not just A plus B, It's this relationship, this interaction between me and you has never happened before. And it's a new thing, because now the interaction that is me is interacting with something entirely new, and so me is different. Probably that doesn't make sense. That's just me kind of setting the stage and trying to express what I understand so far quickly. But I'm sure that this will get fleshed out more in this paper. So, as I do, I'm just going to read it, and I will riff on it. I will try to make sense of it as I go along. So, a process concept of relationship by Eugene Gendlin. Most present concepts about human behavior, self-awareness, etc., refer to the individual. Relationship is therefore something mysterious. Either it is a vague third floating between two individuals, or it can't be considered except as perceptions by individuals of each other. A vague third, right? I guess he's saying like a third entity of some kind, right? Their relationship is some kind of abstract thing, third thing between two individuals. Or it's just this thing that is perceived by each person. Okay. But yeah, that's what I was saying about like a process model is an alternative to this way of seeing reality where everything is atomic and individual to begin with, right? That's how we normally think of things. Certainly in Western culture, everything is broken apart first. Individualism, right? And then we put those things together and we build things together, like that very famous metaphor within the creative world of like long-term, laying brick by brick every single day to build your cathedral, right? It's like the cathedral is this thing that you have designed in your mind and you're building it bit by bit. Building blocks. That's how we build reality. Most present concepts about human behavior are built on models of things. They view the self as a structure, feelings as items of information that are seen or hidden, right? So structure, the cathedral, feelings as items, data, or content, right? As he has talked about in other papers. We are not just content. We are not just structure, right? A structure oftentimes is a non-living thing. I've been thinking about this. I haven't really explored it too much, but like so much of like engineering, for example, successful engineering in many ways is about stopping process from happening, stopping movement, right? We want a bridge to not move. We want a building to not move and to withstand the fact that everything moves, right? So if we build a really, really good structure, it's not moving. It's not alive. And that can be very useful, not to say it's bad, but that's, it's not a living organism. We talked about in the last video I made about the implicit and the unconscious and the pre-conscious, right? So things that are either seen and conscious, or in Freud's language, I guess, pre-conscious, right? It's like we know it, but we maybe are just not thinking about it at this moment, but we can just immediately bring it to mind. Or they're hidden from us entirely and we're just unaware. And Gendlin's whole thing about the implicit and the felt sense is that there's an in-between, right? There's that which we are aware of and conscious of, and then there's that which we just have no awareness of. But then there's that boundary area where we are aware of it, but we can't explicate it yet. In the present paper, self and feeling will be viewed with concepts on a process model. The paper will attempt to show that questions about relationship can be answered with more adequacy to the experienced or observed facts if such a process model is used to conceptualize self and feeling. So, interesting. This paper long precedes his actual book, Process Models. So, it's cool that he was already using that term so long before, but I'm not sure how much I should explicate there. I mean, I've already explained a little bit about what it means. So the paper will attempt to show that questions about relationship can be answered more adequately in relation to the experience or observe facts if we use a process model to conceptualize self and feeling. Right? So not individual, not atomic, but interaction, process first. Self as interaction, feeling as interaction or process, movement. Okay, so the conceptual model. As the conceptual model, let us take a flow. The specific characteristic of a flow, which we will apply below to human behavior, is as follows. All along its line, a flow depends on whether or not the further end of it allows the flow. If the flow may not pass at its further end, then there is no flow at all, not anywhere all the way up to the line. Right? So if you think about a river, and then you put a dam in the river, the flow of the river stops. Of course, the dam can be opened and there can be a flow, but if you simply put a dam, the flow stops. It's interesting I've never really read a definition of a flow. All along its line, a flow depends on whether or not the further end of it allows the flow. The concept of an electric current illustrates what we have said. If at any point in an electric line the current is blocked, it flows nowhere in that whole line. A pipeline is another example of such a flow concept. If Syrians near the ocean block the oil pipeline from Iraq, then it does not flow even in Iraq. It follows that a flow concept encourages an analysis of the conditions of flow in the whole system, not only in one part. For example, it is quite clear that studies of an electric lamp as such will not reveal when it lights and when not. The first part of that makes sense. So to examine the flow, we have to basically take like a systems theory perspective on it and look at the whole thing, right? Movement in the whole thing. You can't just look at one isolated part. Studies of an electric lamp as such will not reveal when it lights and when not. I don't totally understand, like, if you only look at the lamp without looking at the flow of electricity through it, I guess. Okay. The self as process. If we can conceptualize the self as process, we may then ask, what are the conditions all along the line of this process which make movement of the process possible in the self? Relationship will then be seen as part of this line along which the process moves. Okay. So self as process. So self as flow. He didn't exactly say that yet. As the conceptual model, let's take a flow, right? So he hasn't yet said flow is process, but I feel like I can fill in that connection, but acknowledge he hasn't made that one-to-one yet. But if we can conceptualize the self as process, as flow, let's say, we may then ask, what are the conditions all along the line of this process which make the movement of the process possible in the self, right? So the flow within the self. What are the conditions that allow for the movement of the flow within the self? And in vice versa, how does the flow of the self, in the self, through the self, get stopped? Relationship will then be seen as part of this line along which the process moves, right? Because we're thinking in terms of not just looking at atomic pieces, individual pieces, right? We're looking at this in a systems way. As individuals and in an environment, and another person can be a part of that person's environment, and maybe something about that other person can inhibit or facilitate the process and the flow. The self can be considered to be a process for several reasons and in several ways. A person includes a body and a physiological processes. So-called mental and emotional processes are in some way a part of a living organism. Living here denotes changing, acting, processing. An organism, furthermore, lives in an environment, an interaction with it. Hence, the physiological, emotional, and mental processes are in interaction with or toward the environment. Feelings can be considered as tendencies or precursors or prediction of action. Also, they are themselves some kind of processes of both physiological and experienced dimensions. They are experiencing ongoing changing. Right? So the paper that we read before, I think, precedes this one about experiencing, right? There is this raw experiencing, the raw sense of what's going on in us, which is always accessible if we turn our attention to it. Right? It's ongoing, it's always changing. Feelings are that. So this interaction, right? Action in between oneself and one's environment. I interact with it. Even, again, like the example that I used before of breathing, it's an interaction with our environment. There's the air out there, and then there's an action. It's inside of us, but it's an action, right? This expansion of our lungs is happening together with, it's an interaction. It engages with the environment. In short, we may consider the person, including the self and feelings, as a process in interaction with an environment. So the person is a process in interaction with an environment. There's a movement between here and out there, acting together back and forth in flow. Right? I mean, if you're dead, you're not breathing, so you're not even interacting at all with the environment anymore. There's no flow. There's no interaction, taking in the environment, proceeding into the environment. There's no more flow. There's no more process. What will this concept help explain? Changing due to deep feeling of what is, an application of process concept of self. Changing due to deep feeling of what is. That's a really cool way of articulating it. The self as process is always particular. It is always this process going on in interaction with this environment, these feelings tending to these actions, etc. Yeah, it's not abstract, right? It's implicit. It's the feeling that I have right now in my body that I don't even have words for. I haven't even abstracted it enough to conceptualize it and give it a handle, right? It's extremely particular to me and my feeling in this moment and in interaction with this environment. It's not general. In therapy, we deal with the self in process. That is one reason why we are not concerned with diagnostic concepts during the hour. Such concepts are about the person in general. Instead, we ask, what is he feeling now, here, with me? To try to grasp and respond to what is now happening, ongoing processing, that is, changing. I should say that's, he's not saying it, but that's not what all therapy is like, right? A lot of therapy is about pathologizing and coming up with a diagnostic. That's what the DSM is. Diagnostic manual. Right? But that's about generalizing from the person, putting that person into a category, not attending to what is hyper-specific about what's going on with the person now. It's about saying, they have this and this and this and this and this symptom, so they have this thing. They have this pathology. A thing or structure is either here or there in space, but it continues to be the same through time. So he didn't say the words there, but like a concept, right? Well, kind of, what I was saying before was structure. To successfully build a structure is to build something that withstands change over time. As everything else changes, the structure does not, and that it's a successful structure. We want that. And that's a wonderful thing about Gendlin, is that he doesn't just throw that out. He's like, yeah, we're building a process model. We here in the philosophy and in the therapy stuff are looking at process and movement, but let's not just throw out the whole idea of things and structure and concepts. Those are important. We owe the entire civilized world and everything that we do to that. It's important. It's useful. That's one of the things I really love about Gendlin. He's really not he doesn't banish things. He doesn't try to overturn ideas. He sets up alternatives and says, but what we had before also works. But let's think about the context and when and how. A process, on the other hand, is not the same at different points in time. It is a changing, and if considered at different time points, it has already changed. Only as a changing can it be considered through time. However, it does occur at once at many points in space, like an electric current. So it does occur at once at many points in space, right? So a flow, a process, an electric current is happening at many points in space all at once, right? There's 2 points of a river or whatever. But it can only be considered through time as a changing. If it doesn't change, it's not a process, right? If the river yesterday hasn't flowed at all 10 days from now, it's not really a river. It's like a lake. It's a reservoir, right? It's only a process. It's only a flow in as much as it changes over time. It is a changing. It is not the same at different points in time. It follows logically from the definition of a process that it is a changing, and that at different time points, different At different time points, differences will be found in it. It follows logically, for instance, that if the self is a process, then it is a changing. This conclusion does not, however, follow only logically. I'm just going to keep going. We can observe that the change in self-structure is a result of experiencing or feeling or exploring or relating. The self-structure, considered as a thing that is the same through time, for example, self after therapy, is observed to have changed in a process of experiencing or feeling. So with these underlines, right, some verbing, some action has taken place. We have been feeling, I can't think of what the grammatical term is, right? But it's like to be engaged in the action. It's ongoing. Self-structure as something that is not changing is observed to have changed as a result of the experiencing that happened during therapy, right? So this thing, this concept of self, or whatever, the structure self, this unchanging idea of me has, or not unchanging, but like this concept, let's just use that for now. This concept of self, this concept of me has changed over the course of an hour due to the experiencing and the feeling activity process that I went through during the hour. The process which occurred changed the concept thing. At each point in time, it's different as a result of the process that intervened. We observe that feeling something through, or deeply, or really, makes the self different thereafter. Yet what was felt in such a moment is usually something old and unchanged. It was not felt to be different. It was felt as it is and has been for years. Why does such deep feeling change the self, even while no change in the content of what is felt is noticeable? So that's going back to the header, right? Changing due to a deep feeling of what is. So again, he's like referring, where was I here? Simply feeling something deeply as it is leads to change, leads to feeling different after. We feel something which we've had and we've felt before, but we now feel it deeper in the context of the therapy hour, for example. We experience it more fully than we've ever experienced it. And that by itself changes us. How the hell does that work? Feeling something through, like all the way through, feeling it all the way, feeling it, really feeling it, actually really feeling it. Be like, I'm not just going to be like, oh, I'm pissed off about this thing. It's like, no, I'm actually going to feel all of that sense of anger and everything that there is to it. And if you do that, you change. Ironically. If the self is considered only as a structure. It is mysterious why it changes through experiencing something old and unchanged, but we do observe it to do so. If the self is considered also as a feeling process or an experiencing process, it follows logically that it is a changing. The changing that we observed as a result of experiencing can be logically conceptualized by thinking of the self as a process of feeling, experiencing, interacting. An experiencing is a changing, and a feeling and an interacting are also changings. Right, so if it is also, in addition to being considered a structure, considered as a feeling process or an experiencing process, again, you can check out my video on his paper about experiencing, and the link to the paper is in the description of that video. But that raw experiencing, noticing just the feeling experience of life in our bodies, that is a constantly changing thing, right? Our heart is always beating. The blood, if we are alive, is always moving. We're always breathing, right? Life is in process. It is a changing. To be alive is to be changing. So the changing that we observe as a result of experiencing can be logically conceptualized by thinking of the self as a process of these things. Right? To feel something deeply or through or really is an interaction as well. That's part of the process. It's an action. It's an interaction with what's in us. Because remember, interaction is not simply with what's outside of us. We ourselves are interactions. We are full of interaction inside of us and with the outside of us. So we are interacting with that feeling in us when we feel it deeply or really, right? And that is a process. And that process is changing. It is a changing. We have shown then that the concept of the self as an experiencing and feeling process logically conceptualizes the fact that change occurs with deep feeling, even while the content of the feeling appears old and unchanged. So that's an interesting thing, because I'm doing my videos on focusing-oriented therapy highlights, and he talks about how the contents do in fact change as we pay closer attention to them, right? And we sense their edge. So I don't know, maybe he just hadn't really conceptualized that at this point, or what, or maybe he's pointing at something else here. The content of the feeling appears old and unchanged, right? Like my memory of this experience that I had as a kid, which is always deeply triggering, like my memory of it remains the same, but now in this past hour of therapy, I spent more time feeling it all the way through as it really is. I think, at least in later years, Gendlin would then say like the actual memory and the experience of that memory and all the associated felt sense and everything has in fact changed as well. But I don't know, he's not saying that here. But he is saying that if we do it, we change. How do therapeutic conditions bring denied feeling to awareness? Another application of the process concept of self. Due to Freudian concepts of unconscious and repression, it has become customary to consider feelings as something in people. They are in people, whether or not the people act on them or even know of them. Remember, things are things that do not change over time. So this thing that doesn't change over time is in us, whether we know it or not. This way of thinking encourages one to consider feelings as entities or things. When these feelings come to awareness, they are considered to be the same as they were when they were denied, except now the person knows about them. Right? So whether we know about them or not, they are always one and the same thing. Let us consider feeling as a process. If we do that, then denied feelings are not objects lying either in the shadow of repression or in the light of consciousness. Instead, we would consider them as being in process or as being stopped, dammed up, not being feeling at all, but merely inhibited tendency to feel. Right, okay, so we're going from Freud's thing of feelings as things that just exist in the same way over time. And then alternatively, let us consider feeling as a process, right? Something that is in flow. If we do that, then denied feelings are not objects. Denied as in interesting, he hasn't used that word in this section until here. So denied sounds to me like you're kind of aware of it, but then you push it away, right? They're not objects lying either in the shadow of repression or in the light of consciousness. Instead, we would consider them as being in process or as being stopped. So why doesn't he say more about denied here? They are either in process or they are stopped. Not in flow, right? And if something is not in flow, then it is a thing, right? If you have a river and you put a dam, then it becomes a reservoir and it's just a body of water. There's no flow anymore. It just stays there. So a feeling, if you consider it that way as a metaphor, right? If you stop it, if you deny it, maybe, that feeling just turns into a reservoir. It becomes a thing that doesn't change, doesn't move, it doesn't flow, because it's been inhibited. If the self is conceived of as a structure, then a denied feeling, thing lying in the dark, comes to awareness and then becomes integrated into the self structure. Interesting. Integration, right? Because some people talk about shadow integration, right? So these things that are out of our awareness, in the shadow, we then bring them into the light and integrate them into ourself. Like putting this thing into this larger structure that is conscious. Taking things out of the shadow and putting them into the structure that's in the light. If the self is conceived of as a structure. If the self is conceived of as a process, a feeling is of this process, or it is not in process at all. If the feeling isn't in process, then it isn't feeling. It might be a pressure, a tension, a static potential, analogous to an electric potential in a broken circuit. In the previous video, I was talking about somatic meditation and how in the meditation I do there, when you're focusing on the tension in your body, the guy Reggie Ray, he talks about tension as being the boundary between the conscious and unconscious. And I was talking about how, the different ways in which we tense ourselves in order to stop processes, right? In order to stop crying, in order to cut off or make the feeling of pain less, right? Or we tense our abdominal groin muscles in order to not pee, right? How do you stop peeing? You do Kegels or whatever. You have to be able to stop the flow by tensing. Or even like if you're getting hit, as I said, you tense your muscles to basically become a shield against this thing coming at you from the outside, to stop motion. So if a feeling isn't in process, then it isn't a feeling. It is just this thing in potential. So that's interesting. I mean, because then it's like, okay, tension, pressure, and yet we feel those things, right? We feel pressure in us. We feel tension in us. So how does that work? I don't feel completely mystified about that, but I'm just going to keep that question open. My hypothesis basically would be like, well, there's other process going on, process of attention, for example. The way in which that tension interacts with other processes within us, which we can then feel, right? Because everything else in us is moving, and then there's this other thing that's not moving, we can feel that because it's in the way of everything else. It's inhibiting the flow. Now, if there is a self at all, some process or changing is always going on. Let us call such feelings as are of this process in-process feelings. Feelings which are not of it, let us call potential feelings, analogous to potential energy. Such potential feelings don't change. We have them in the same way for years, just like a battery keeps its static electricity. Okay? I think that's pretty straightforward. Feelings that are in process versus feelings that are not in process. If it's not in process, it's stuck. It's not moving. It's in potential. It's a reservoir, right? It's stopped, and if you opened the gates, it would move. The potential would be, whatever you say, actualized. Now, our question. What conditions make in-process feelings possible, and what conditions hold feelings potential? One answer, which our concept logically implies, is in-process feelings will be possible if the further end of the process allows the flow to move, right? So that's going all the way back to beginning, when he defined a flow. If the further parts of the flow are uninhibited, then the flow can happen. So, an in-process feeling if it is in process, will be such that the end of the process, whatever that is, right? I'm guessing he's going to talk about another person as part of our system, part of our environment, allows the flow to move. So yeah, what is the further end of a feeling process? Feelings are action tendencies. They are some of the organism's interaction with environment. Hence, they are precursors, startings, endeavors at action. Right? Precursors, startings, endeavors at action. Like they are the beginning of action. They are beginning of interaction with environment. So considered, action is the further end of a feeling process. If action is completely blocked, feelings will become merely potential. If it becomes possible, feelings will become in process. So if an action is able to happen, then the flow will continue and the feeling will not be stopped. Right? The feeling is the beginning of an action, so if it can be carried out, then the flow can occur. But if not, then the feeling is just stuck. Right? If you're angry and you want to hit somebody and you can't do that for whatever reason, because you're nice and you don't want to hit them, for example, then that feeling is just going to be in you, right? Like it's not able to move. Not to say that there aren't other ways for that feeling to move, but the feeling that is a precursor to that action of hitting is stuck. Actions, however, are of many sorts. They include speech, gesture, and other symbolic acts, as well as ordinary action. Symbolic is underlined, right? I've said in past videos to focus is to symbolize raw experience. Symbolize, symbolic. It logically follows that whenever any of these sorts of action is possible, feelings tending toward it will become in process. The flow at the upper end of the line can move when the further end of it allows movement. We are conceptualizing a denied feeling as merely a potential pressure. On the other hand, a feeling in process is part of the aware self. Are there then any observations which would make this a useful way of conceptualizing the coming to awareness of denied feeling? This part is kind of interesting. Aware self. It's part of the aware self. There's not much said so far to make sense of that. The aware self as opposed to the unaware self, right? Aware is a way of being. It's in and of itself is kind of an action, right? A process. To be aware, to put your awareness into things. A self that is in process, a self that is aware of what is going on, right? We've also talked about conscious and unconscious. So feeling in process is part of the aware self. Aware Why is that important to specify aware? I don't know. I feel like I could explain it if I spent more time here, but I don't want to spend that time. Well, I guess is it because if you're unaware, then the actions can't take place? Or if you're unaware, that stoppage can't be unblocked, right? And then the feeling can't flow? I don't know. Maybe that's what he's saying. Okay. We do observe that the opportunity for expressive action brings about the emergence of feelings into awareness, or, as we would say, allows feelings to be in process. We also speak of therapy as allowing a client to feel his feelings through. We observe at such times that while he has felt anxiety, tension, fear, self-deprecation, he has not felt through. We mean he hasn't felt that feeling through, which is for him represented by all these feelings about it. Once he does feel it through, it is never quite the same again. So, the opportunity for expressive action brings about the emergence of feelings into awareness. Right, so interesting, he's also bringing it into awareness, right? Bringing it from not aware to aware is a movement already. So it's not just in potential if there's expressive action happening and things are becoming, if you're becoming aware of a thing, it's not stuck. Well, yeah, I mean, he hasn't said that outright exactly, but if it's moving, if it's moving from unaware to aware, that in and of itself is a change. It's a process, right? It's flow. So, yeah, like when in my somatic meditation, for example, you're focusing on bringing awareness to the tension, and there's that border zone of the conscious and the unconscious. And as you spend more time on that source of tension, it sort of begins to recede, and that which is on the other side of the tension, hidden from you, right? It becomes, you begin to be aware of it. It becomes conscious. And there's a movement happening. So in therapy also, that's what's happening, basically, that feelings are going from being unaware to awareness. So they're becoming in process again. How does this part work, though? We observe at such times that while he has felt these things, he has not felt through. We mean he hasn't felt that feeling through, which is for him that feeling, which is represented by all these feelings. Represented. Is that like, so the thing, that feeling, this is how I'm kind of reading this, making sense of it. That feeling is unconscious. He's unaware of it, but it's represented, right? It is aware in some sense, in as much as he has felt anxiety, tension, fear, self-deprecation. And Yeah. So that thing is out of awareness, but is represented by those things that are in awareness. And within therapy, he feels it through. I almost want to say like the through is through that barrier between the unconscious and the conscious, right? The thing that is hidden passes through that border zone and becomes conscious, and it has passed through, he has felt it through into awareness, and it is never quite the same again. Yeah, I mean, that's one way to read it anyway. These observations follow logically from our process concept of feeling. It follows logically from that concept that, as also observed, the opportunity for expressive action allows feelings to be in flow and in change and aware in process. The opportunity for expressive action allows feelings to be in flow and in change and aware. Yeah, that makes sense with everything that's been said so far, right? Feelings as a precursor to action, and if the action part is not possible, then the feelings are stuck in potentia, right? Their potential action. But if expressive action is allowed, then those feelings can move and be in process. More observations can be cited to show that feelings emerge to awareness in the act of symbolization and expression. Clients find that describing exactly what they feel helps them move on to more hidden feelings. Also, it enlivens the feeling. Saying it just right and hearing it back reflected just right often makes the feeling more immediate and stronger. Such increased intensity of it often makes the feeling open up so that more of it can be symbolized just right and become more intense and further open up. So he's talking about active listening in the Carl Rogers sense, right? Or as in focusing partner is like, oh, you're feeling this, you're noticing this, just reflecting what the person has said. And then also saying it just right is, that resonating, right? Finding a handle and resonating it back with the felt sense until it's just right. Right, so hearing it reflected might even just mean doing that yourself. Resonating it back, resonating the handle back against the felt sense to see if it is just right. And if it is, there's a movement there. Clients find that the therapy hour rarely goes as planned. Even the first thing he planned to say is often already surprisingly different in the very first act of saying it. It reminds me of making these videos. I don't know what I'm going to say. It's a surprise. Yeah, I mean, if the therapy hour goes as planned, then nothing new is discovered, right? Contrarily, an inaccurate symbolization stops the feeling. Reasons that make it impossible to express to the therapist often stop feelings. Reasons that make it impossible to express to the therapist
often stop I feel like I understand what he means, but just going purely off these two sentences is kind of weird. Like how the inaccurate symbolization goes with the next part. I guess if like the therapist doesn't get what the client is feeling, doesn't get it, doesn't express it back, like if I'm trying to express back to you what you're feeling and I just constantly say it not as you are expressing it, so that it's never accurate and just right, then maybe you begin to feel like you can't be heard, right? And so the ability to express yourself for whatever reason gets hindered and inhibited. If you stop feeling that you can express yourself by speaking and expressing your feeling, then that ability for the feelings to be in flow, in process, is stopped, and then they're just going to be stuck again. So now I guess we're kind of getting into the relationship part of how flow is hindered or helped. These observations can be conceptualized most easily if feeling and expressive action are seen to be one process. Although expressive action appears to be outside and feelings inside, yet feeling cannot really move without expressive action. This puzzle is quite resolved if our concept represents a flow which occurs in both places or not at all. Right? Yeah, I mean, that's what he said in the beginning. A flow depends on the flowing at every point. If it's not flowing at one point, then it's not a flow. So if the action part, if the expression part can't happen, then the feelings can't really be in process either. There's no flow between the two. Expressive action is movement at one expressive action is movement at one space point of the process and permits simultaneous movement at the other space points of the process. Expressive action is movement at the far end at one space point of the process that simultaneously allows for movement elsewhere in the process. That's what expressive action is. Expression is therefore so vital to the client. By expressing, he can not only see his feelings, he can actively feel them. His feelings can move. Instead of being potential and unaware, they can become in process. It's interesting, the see there, what he means by that. He hasn't really said anything about seeing, but maybe see as in you can see yourself acting, right? Doing something. I'm getting tired. I'm not sure if I should just wrap this up and do a part 2 later. I think I might. I already made a whole earlier video. Yeah, I'm gonna stop this and have a part 2. So here we are. What may be considered expressive action. We'll pick up there.